Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Carl Weisenbach, director of this great institution known as the Eisenhower Presidential Library, Museum, and Boyhood Home. Before the program gets started, just a couple of things here. Please note that we are being televised, which means that if you got a question for our guest, you will have to go out in the alleyway and make sure that someone gives you the microphone. So anyway, once again, I want to welcome you to tonight's program. We are so delighted to have Mr. Edsel with us again. He was here for a number of years ago, as you probably remember. In fact, I was in a grocery store and told me, you don't need to spend too much time in your introduction. Let's get right into the program, because he was such a fascinating individual and so forth. So I'll try to, I remember that, I hope, right? So anyway, to make a long story short, we're so pleased that you are here tonight, and we do hope that you enjoy the program. And I must also thank the many donors that have made programs like this possible here in Abilene. As you probably have heard me say over and over and over, we can't do it without funds, and a number of you have stepped up and provided funding for specific programs. And I also want to say a special thank you to the members of the Eisenhower Foundation that are here this evening, as well as the staff here at the Presidential Library. I think it's always a positive sign when your fellow employees come to events like this. So getting to the program here, Robert Edsel is the #1 New York Times best-selling author of 3 non-fiction books: Saving Italy, the Race to Rescue a Nation's Treasures from the Nazis, The Monuments Men, Allied Heroes, Nazi Thieves, and the Greatest Treasure Hunt in History, and of course it's Rescuing Da Vinci. A film based on Mr. Edsel's book, The Monuments Men, directed by and starring Academy Award winner George Clooney, was released in February 2014. In November 2014, Edsel was presented with the Records of Achievement Award from the Foundation for the National Archives. The award recognizes an individual whose work has fostered a broader national awareness of the history, identity of the United States through the use of original records. And I can tell you, being part of the National Archives, that is a huge award, and congratulations again for you receiving that award. Copies of his books and the DVD are available for purchase in the Presidential Gift Shop. Following the program, Mr. Edsel will be available to autograph the items. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Robert Edsel.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be back in Abilene, 5 years from when I was here last time on this same occasion, and I think we should certainly begin the evening by stopping for a moment and asking if we have any World War II veterans with us or anybody with military service, would you please stand so we can thank you for your service to our country. And Carl, I want to thank you and the staff here, Tim Reeves and others, for the great work you do. And it's always a privilege to come to Abilene and speak here in the home of a man who I admire so greatly, General Eisenhower. I'm very frequently corrected about that. President Eisenhower, well, he's always general to me. But I want to talk tonight about General Eisenhower and the events of May 8th, but I also want to focus on a bigger issue that brings us to contemporary world we're living in today. And the comment and title of my remarks is Preserving the Past, What Will Our Legacy Be? The message so many years ago, 70 years ago, contained no sign of celebration or grandiloquent prose. The mission of this Allied force was fulfilled at 0241 local time, May 7th, 1945. Having informed the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington that the war in Europe was over, a weary General Dwight Eisenhower, who for more than 1,000 days thought only of victory, quietly headed to bed. World War II was the most destructive conflict in history, and it proved an unprecedented test of mankind's determination to preserve its most venerated, artistic and cultural treasures for future generations. What then will be said 70 years from now about how we responded to the challenge of protecting our artistic and cultural heritage today? Will future generations reflect on our efforts with pride as we do those who preserve civilization's cultural heritage during World War II? Or will they wonder what we were thinking as we watched the Islamic State, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and others systematically loot and pulverize treasures of our ancient world? More importantly, how can we as unarmed citizens make a difference? Let's begin by opening the report card on the past. The first world leader to make the wartime protection of cultural treasures a priority was President Lincoln. Precisely 80 years later, another president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, went even further by approving plans that ultimately led to the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives section, a group of soldier scholars known as the Monuments Men. But no leader demonstrated greater concern and respect for cultural treasures during war and after than Dwight D. Eisenhower. In December 1943, when the effort of a handful of monuments officers to protect the innumerable cultural treasures of Sicily and southern Italy was failing, Eisenhower issued an order that would change the face of war. Consider the words of this soldier schooled in the science of destruction. Today we are fighting in a country which has contributed a great deal to our cultural inheritance, a country rich in monuments which by their creation helped and now in their old age illustrate the growth of civilization which is ours. We are bound to respect those cultural treasures so far as war allows. Eisenhower's order not only endorsed the Monuments Men in their mission, it created a shared burden for the protection of cultural treasures among his commanders and troops. Eisenhower issued a similar order in England 2 weeks before the D-Day landings in Normandy. Determined to set an example for the German people, quite the opposite of that of the Nazis, General Eisenhower expected troops in the armies under his command to observe codes of conduct that prohibited the removal of works of art and other cultural objects. Reports about violations of these rules infuriated him. One of Eisenhower's commanders, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, sternly reminded the commanding generals within his army group that we are a conquering army, not a pillaging army. Still, the problem persisted. Lieutenant General Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff, acting at the direction of the Supreme Allied Commander, issued further orders stating that looting carried on in liberated countries must, by every human standard, be considered a more despicable offense than when practiced in enemy territory. Nevertheless, such behavior in Germany will have very serious results, and if persisted in, may seriously endanger the objectives of the occupation. Despite the difficulties of enforcing these orders, Eisenhower was unrelenting in his expectations that the conduct of his commanders and troops set the highest moral standard. At war's end, in a break with conquerors past, the policy of the Western Allied nations stated that all looted objects would be returned to the countries from which they had been stolen. The discovery of thousands of mines and castles filled with works of art and other cultural treasures underscored the magnitude of the challenge that lay ahead. Having inspected one of these mines, Eisenhower knew that the Monuments Men would need time to sort through hundreds of thousands of objects. He began by ordering the immediate restitution of the most high-profile works of art, that they would be taken back to each of the lead alliance nations. Delivery of the Ghent altarpiece to Belgium began what would be an ongoing rotation of returned masterpieces. Eisenhower's order bought much-needed time for the Monuments Men and women to identify and return what in the end totaled almost 4 million stolen objects. Imagine that. Less well known is their custodial role in safeguarding almost 1 million objects belonging to German museums and private individuals that were held in custody until the museums could be rebuilt and reopened. All of this turned over to the Federal Republic of Germany in 1951. In the years that followed the end of the war, General Eisenhower received many awards, including an honorary fellowship from the trustees of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Eisenhower gave a remarkable speech on the 2nd of April, 1946, and as a result of one of our most important research discoveries, we now have the opportunity to hear what he had to say.
It may seem strange that a soldier, representative of the science of destruction, should appear before a body dedicated to the preservation of man's creative ideals as expressed in art. Even though we acknowledge that the soldier's true function is to prevent rather than to wage war, yet his necessary association with lethal weapons would seem to imply the existence of an unbridgeable gulf between his philosophy and that of the artist. Perhaps this is so. Certainly I lay no claim to artistic temperament. But I do know that for democracy, at least, there always stands beyond the materialism and destructiveness of war the ideals for which it is fought. Thus, the awful test of war is primarily a testing of the spirit, and so it is possible for the fighting man to experience in war a definite spiritual growth. But for simpler reasons than these, I believe that many of our veterans have gained renewed interest in art and the world of the artist. These same soldiers have seen the destruction of priceless artistic treasures. But, and perhaps understandably, this fact has served only to increase their respect and veneration for civilizations of the past. They tried, within, sometimes beyond the limits of military prudence, to preserve and protect these products of man's creative instinct. But war is essentially destruction. An army at war must incessantly hurl destructive force at the enemy. And in this process, much of the world's heritage in art has been inevitably damaged and lost in the late global conflict. I am grateful to the directors of the Metropolitan Museum for their generosity in having accorded me an honorary membership for my small part in protecting these monuments. The credit belongs to the officers and men of the combat echelons whose veneration for priceless treasures persisted, even in the heat and fears of battle. Another view of the fate of art in war was presented to our soldiers when, at long last, we penetrated to the heart of Nazism. There, in caves, in mines, and in isolated mountain hideouts, we found that Hitler and his gang, with unerring instinct for enriching themselves, had stored art treasures, filched from their rightful owners throughout conquered Europe. Alongside bar and minted gold were found paintings, statues, tapestries, jewelry, and all else that the Nazis knew mankind would pay much to rescue and to preserve. Some of this has been restored. Some, not easy to identify, is still under the care of the captors. Freedom enjoyed by this country from the desolation that has swept over so many others during the past years gives to America greater opportunity than ever before to become the greatest of the world's repositories of art. The whole world will then have a right to look to us with grateful eyes. But we will fail unless we consciously appreciate the value of art in our lives and take practical steps to encourage the artist and preserve his works. In no walk of life can man fail to find richer experience as he falls under the influence of beauty, immortalized by inspired genius. Even for the roughest of soldiers, there is more of ancient Egyptian history to be felt and understood in a lonely, graceful column rising against the sky in a naked field than there is in all the descriptive matter that was ever written on the subject. It is our privilege to pass on to the coming centuries treasures of past ages and to add to these the artistic creations of our own. But now, today, hundreds of returned soldiers will profit by your help in creative effort, and thousands more will gain inspiration from your exhibits. They who have dwelt with death will be among the most ardent worshipers of life and beauty and of the peace in which these can thrive.
So imagine a general today getting up and speaking for 15 minutes about the importance of art in our lives. And for those of you wishing to hear the full extent of Eisenhower's remarks, you can visit the Monuments Men Foundation website where we have the entire remarks, 14 minutes. Really extraordinary moment. And I want to bore in for a moment on these last words that Eisenhower spoke. Consider them closely. It is our privilege to pass on to the coming centuries treasures of past ages. Now, Eisenhower could have used the word duty or obligation, and while those words would certainly describe one reason for his attention to cultural treasures during World War II, I think they fall short of capturing the fullness of his feelings. Eisenhower instead chose the word privilege, which is commonly defined as a special opportunity to do something that makes you proud. And I witnessed something of this pride a few years ago when I visited his home in Gettysburg. And I had a brief orientation outdoors with the Park Service ranger who gave me this tour, and we walked into the formal living room, and there was a vitrine just to the right after walking in there. This is a room that he and Mamie actually rarely used because they thought it was too fancy. And in this vitrine, there were all these different trinkets on several different glass shelves, and one of which very quickly caught my eye, and it was a miniature reproduction of the Ghent altarpiece. And as I suspected, when I got behind it and looked, I could see that it was a gift to him from the former King of Belgium, Leopold III, no doubt an expression of gratitude to General Eisenhower for his role in returning that, the very first masterpiece to return to any of the countries, and it was returned to Belgium. Eisenhower certainly had a heightened sense of culture, no doubt from the year he spent traveling in Europe in 1928 as head of the American Battle Monuments Commission. And I attribute, though, his commitment to preservation of cultural treasures to something far less distant and far simpler to understand. Dwight D. Eisenhower was an honorable man who strived to do the right thing and inspire others to follow his lead. He considered the taking of others' property as wrong, especially during a war or as an occupying force. He believed that the right conduct of war demanded that everything possible be done to minimize damage to cultural treasures. 390,000 American men and women lost their lives during World War II. 8,301 are buried at the Netherland American Cemetery in Margraten, Holland. I want to focus on just one, monuments man Walter Huchthausen. W.H. Auden once wrote, "To save your world, you ask this man to die. Would this man, could he see you now, ask why? Does Huchthausen rest in peace, or would he be given the lip service that has been paid to the preservation of cultural treasures since the end of World War II, the poetic figure in Auden's speech asking why?" Walter Huchthausen enlisted for military service in 1942 at the age of 37. His career as an architect made him an ideal candidate to serve Allied military government as a monuments man. But severe injuries he suffered during a V-1 bombing attack on London delayed his initial assignment. In late 1944, Captain Hutchhausen reported for duty as monuments officer for U.S. Ninth Army in Aachen, Germany, repairing its world-famous Gothic cathedral. Interviewed about his work several months later, he told a reporter, quote, "Aachen Cathedral belongs to the world, and if we can prevent it from falling in ruins, we are doing a service to the world." The article appeared in print on April 4th, but Hutchhausen wasn't alive to see it. 2 days earlier, he'd been killed in a machine gun attack by Germans while in transit to check on a report of looted art. The death of Hutchhausen, like that of British monuments officer Ronald Balfour, underscores the ultimate cost of protecting works of art and other cultural treasures during war. Is art worth a life? It's a question that not only goes to the very soul of the work of the monuments men during World War II, but also frames the debate about how we as a society respond to the protection of works of monuments and arts in Syria, in Iraq, in Egypt, Mali, and other conflict areas. Can the sacrifice of a human life to save a building or a priceless work of art or the most rare of historical documents ever be a noble trade? Eisenhower believed that the answer must be no, stating that a human life counts infinitely more. Monuments officer Captain Dean Keller, a 42-year-old professor of art at Yale University and an artist himself, agreed. Keller, whose 3-year-long service in Italy included a year-and-a-half in or near combat zones, once wrote, "No work of art is worth the life of a single American boy." But Keller made a critical distinction between risking one's life to save a work of art versus risking one's life fighting for a cause. Like his fellow monuments men, Keller considered it a privilege to represent his country, to preserve the freedom of creative expression by artists, just as he did preserving the greatest examples of what artists before him had created. General Eisenhower spoke of this during his speech at the Met when he referred to the ideals for which war is fought. The monuments men's service, like Hutchhausen's death, reminds us that freedom was not then, nor will it ever be, free. Preservation of cultural treasures, like our freedom, also comes at a cost. Walter Hutchhausen and his fellow monuments men knew that all too well before volunteering. Still, they wanted to serve. Our history defines us. Works of art, monuments, and other cultural treasures belong to all of us, regardless of the country or museum in which they're located. They are a gift to us from previous generations that serve as a source of learning, enjoyment, and inspiration. These gifts come with an inherent responsibility to do everything prudently possible to preserve them for future generations. No one person had a better understanding of that responsibility than the founder of the Monuments Men, Lieutenant Commander George Stout. In making his case for cultural preservation officers to President Roosevelt in 1943, Stout said it clearly and dispassionately, quote, "To safeguard these things will show respect for the belief and customs of all men and will bear witness that these things belong not only to a particular people, but also to the heritage of mankind. To safeguard these things is part of the responsibility that lies on the governments of the United Nations." Almost 40 years later, Mason Hammond, the only monuments officer to see duty in Italy and Germany, and an important advisor to General Eisenhower's staff, warned all those willing to listen, quote, "Planners for future hostilities tend to think in terms of the last conflict, but any consideration of the different ways in which the First and Second World Wars were fought demonstrates the fallacy of such an approach. If this generation wishes to leave to its children the cultural treasures that it has enjoyed, such planning should be encouraged. But with that warning, the legacy of the monument's men and women effectively ended, reduced to the musings of a diminished group of aging war veterans. Note this, aged or not, Hammond's counsel was not only sound, it proved prescient as events in Iraq in 2003 and more recently in Syria have painfully demonstrated. Today we have a different set of bad guys with a different ideology than those General Eisenhower and the Allies defeated. We must acknowledge certain truths. In a war as complex, uncongealed, and ideologically driven as that in Syria, reason and appeal will find no audience among those in power. We will not defeat the Islamic State and its followers with expressions of outrage. Only advanced planning of the sort mentioned by Monuments man Mason Hammond 35 years ago could have prevented some, if not much, of the destruction we have witnessed these past months. Because that did not happen, many world politicians and international agencies charged with the responsibility for the protection of World Heritage sites are now scrambling. Leaders, oftentimes not elected officials or those assigned to office by appointment, but true leaders like President Roosevelt, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, General George Marshall, and certainly General Dwight Eisenhower, make difficult, even unpopular decisions, born of the crucible of crisis that over time have defined their greatness. They have confidence in their course of action, especially when many others are consumed with doubt. Their credibility and communication skills to inspire others to act were superb. As General Eisenhower once commented, leadership is getting those around you to do what you want them to do because they want to do it. Our world misses those kind of leaders. It needs those kind of leaders. I am but one voice, but having spent 12 years researching the monument's men and women, including a considerable amount of time with 20 or so officers that I became very close to, and many of their children and family friends, I must say this. I watched these Islamic State videos showing murders of the innocents, people, monuments, and works of art, and I am outraged. I read eloquent condemnations of these acts by politicians and officials of the United Nations organizations charged with protecting these shared cultural treasures, and I am outraged. I think about Monuments man Walter Hutchhausen, Ronald Balfour, George Stout, and Mason Hammond and their peers, whose squandered legacy could have provided us with the inspiration and guidance we need today, and I am outraged. I believe a great many people are also outraged, perhaps even you. We can do better. We must do better. At the outset of my remarks, I asked, how can we as unarmed citizens make a difference? You may be tempted to think, what can I do? How can my participation possibly matter? I'm sure there was a moment when many of the men and women who volunteered to become monuments officers asked themselves these same questions. Keep in mind, almost none of them had military backgrounds. Draw encouragement, then, from the backgrounds of these defenders of culture, volunteers all. George Stout, who fathered the concept of cultural preservation officers, conserved works of art. Ronald Balfour was a historian, Walter Hutchhausen an architect. Lincoln Kirstein founded and ran a ballet company. Dean Keller painted portraits. Walker Hancock sculpted. Bernie Taper was a freelance writer. Seymour Pomeranz an archivist. Leonard Woolley was a 63-year-old archaeologist. Harry Ettlinger was an 18-year-old immigrant, German immigrant. Charlie Bernholtz, who like Ettlinger only had a high school education, listed his occupation as motorcyclist. Jim Reeds was a pre-med student. Mary Regan was an officer in the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps. Edith Standen was a secretary. So you see, no matter the background that you may have, something you know, some life experience that you have makes your voice matter. You can help make a difference. The mission of the Monuments Men and Women is unfinished. Hundreds of thousands of works of art and cultural treasures have been missing since the end of World War II. In fact, you may have seen the news earlier this week about our work and the Foundation's discovery and return of 5 important paintings that we found that have been taken from Germany, 3 that belong to a German museum, 2 that belong to a family in Germany, that we recovered from veterans' families that had them, and today they're headed back to their rightful owners in Germany. Against the backdrop of a war that claimed the lives of some 65 million people, these are stories with happy endings made possible because people like you contacted the Foundation with critical information seeking only to do the right thing. And what other country produces people, in particular veterans, that in the twilight of their lives come forward and demonstrate such magnanimity and fairness? The Monuments Men Foundation is a not-for-profit organization that, like the Monuments Men before us, returns missing objects, works of art without charge. The Foundation depends on the financial support of the public, donors large and small. Our focus isn't on how these things got here or elsewhere. We seek only to reunite missing objects with their rightful owners, and in the process, recognize and thank those who want to join our effort to make a difference, especially veterans and their families. The search for these missing objects drags on because no one has known where to look. But we don't need 1,000 detectives to try and solve these mysteries. We only need the assistance and help of the general public, you, to aid us in this search. The public has the answers, but until now, no one has ever asked the public for their help. In a minute, that's getting ready to change. But the challenge we face is far greater than just locating missing works of art. Organizations charged with preserving our shared cultural heritage are instead bearing witness to its destruction. Volunteers on the front lines in these war-torn areas need more help. Suppose for a minute that we end up writing off Syria and all its cultural treasures, assuming nothing will survive the wrath of the Islamic State. What about the next Syria? Will we repeat these same mistakes again? To those who believe the cause is hopeless, I say engage the public, seek their ideas, study their suggestions, involve fresh minds that think differently about problems. Throughout history, no resource has proven more valuable than the ingenuity, resourcefulness, and determination of the human mind and spirit. Here's how you can make a difference. I'm asking you to do 3 easy things. Start by going to the Monuments Men Foundation website, www.monumentsmenfoundation.org, and add your name to our I Am a Monuments Man list of supporters. I want those who would destroy culture belonging to all of us to know that the size of our army is far greater than theirs. And I want those in elected office to know that too. We've made it easy for those that live on their cell phones, as my group does, by being able to text us a message. And we have the information up there, 56512. Text that number and type in monument, and you'll get an immediate text message from us that provides a link to the Foundation's website where you can register your support. Secondly, please join the hunt for some of the hundreds of thousands of missing works of art and cultural treasures that we continue to look for. Over the next 10 years, as we lose the remainder of our World War II generation, whether soldier, displaced person, or immigrant, they'll all be gone. But what they once owned will have a new owner and an increased risk of being sold or inadvertently thrown away. So there is an urgency. We're in a race against time. Help us complete the mission of the Monuments Men and Women. If you have or know of someone who has an art or cultural object that was in Europe between 1933 and 1945 and don't know its ownership during that period, please contact the Monuments Men Foundation at our toll-free number, 1-866-World-War-II-ART, WWIIART. The number's 866-9944-278. You can also email the Foundation through its website. The third step is critical. Share with us and others your ideas and suggestions on how society can do a better job preserving and protecting these cultural treasures that belong to all of us. Your proposed solution may be the one that hasn't been considered. We want and need your ideas. Share the hashtag #IamAMonumentsMan. Let's use social media to unite all those who care about our shared cultural heritage and want their voice to be heard. American anthropologist Margaret Mead told us what Thomas Jefferson, Gandhi, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, Mother Teresa, and Nelson Mandela taught us. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, as it is the only thing that ever has. The ingenuity of man has landed astronauts on the moon and then brought them home safely. In less than 3 decades, it has connected 6 out of 7 of everybody on this earth with a cell phone. It's using science and technology to feed more people in the world than ever before. Life expectancy is increasing. Entrepreneurs, in particular in the technology arena, have, through their creativity and hard work, generated the greatest accumulation of wealth in the history of the world. The brain power and resources exist for us to be doing a better job protecting cultural treasures. But to convert the concept of cultural preservation to a cause, we must add the critical missing component, you, the public. President Lincoln admonished us to remember this. With public sentiment, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. Think about that again. Without public sentiment, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. It would be, I would be remiss in not finishing my remarks with some comments that General Eisenhower made at the London City Hall in June 1945 after the German surrender document was signed, as you saw at the beginning of my remarks. Ike and his general staff went to bed, exhausted from the stress of course, a very long war in the last few days. And General Eisenhower withheld remarks about his views on his role in World War II until arriving in London to receive this great honor from the City of London, and then went out on the balcony to speak to, as you can see, the tens of thousands of people standing on the balconies and parapets of these buildings, all wanting to hear what the victorious general had to say. And Eisenhower, as he was so wont to do, deflected the compliments being given to him and recognized the true credit was the American soldier coming home, G.I. Joe as he referred to him, and in particular all those men and women that would not be coming home. And I think this is always a cautionary moment for those of us who, in the case of the Monuments Men Foundation and our work, trying to bring visibility and credit to these remarkable men and women. We've received a lot of accolades and a lot of attention, and we've been so appreciative of it. It's been quite humbling. But the true credit belongs to these men and women, the cultural heroes of civilization, who not only did this great thing during World War II, but left us this remarkable legacy, which heretofore we've not used in the way that they certainly would have hoped. And I think Eisenhower's remarks really point to the things that are important for us to remember. He said, "The high sense of distinction I feel receiving this great honor is inescapably mingled with feelings of profound sadness. Humility must be the portion of any man who receives acclaim earned in blood of his followers and sacrifices of his friends. He may have given everything of his heart and mind to meet the spiritual and physical needs of his comrades. He may have written a chapter that will glow forever in the pages of military history. Still, such a man, if he existed, would sadly face the facts that his honors cannot hide in his memory crosses marking the resting places of the dead. They cannot soothe the anguish of the widow or the orphan whose husband and father will not return. The only attitude with which a commander may with satisfaction receive the tributes of his friends is in the humble acknowledgement that no matter how unworthy he may be, his position is a symbol of great human forces that have labored arduously and successfully for a righteous cause." I have a righteous cause, and it certainly is the work of the Monuments Men and Women and the Foundation which does this work in their honor. And I hope that you will support the Foundation and support our efforts to not only preserve the legacy of these men and women, but put it to its fullest use. Thank you very much. All right, I think what that means is if anyone wants to ask a question and they dare walk up there to that alarming looking instrument, the stage is yours. Or you can belt it out and I'll repeat it. Okay, there's only one hard question, and that's the first one. Someone asked me earlier, were there monuments officers in the Far East? And the answer is yes. There were a dozen or so men who were American, British, Kiwis, New Zealanders, and Australian. They, most of the Americans served in Japan. The members of the British Royal Empire served in the countries of Southeast Asia because they understood the geography of those areas better. The effort, of course, was very different than it was in Europe because of the way the war unfolded. They couldn't get any boots on the ground until the war was over, so it was largely a rescue mission, whereas much of what took place in Europe was really dealt with the issues of preservation, of getting there and trying to protect things before something befell them. It's a lesser-known part of their legacy. Perhaps the most significant and demonstrable single act I could point to was Langdon Warner, who was an early advisor to the Monuments Men, a professor of art at at Harvard University, who actually hated the classroom. And some believe the Indiana Jones character was actually modeled off of him because he liked being out in the field. He wore this great hat, and he trained so many students at Harvard who went on to work as curators and museum directors in the United States at places like the Nelson Atkins and others that have some of the great collections of Far East art. And that's because Langdon Warner introduced them to these things, and then while they were in the States and he was in China or Japan, when these things could be exported, would identify things and send them off to his students. So he has this wonderful legacy that has so positively impacted our cultural life in the United States. But during World War II, it was Langdon Warner that went to President Roosevelt or his advisors and said, in those critical months of the spring 1945, when the focus was really shifting towards Japan, if you ever hope when this war's over that Japan's going to get back on its feet, you cannot bomb the towns of Kyoto and Nara because they're the cultural capitals of Japan. And in fact, bombing was retasked away from there. I don't know whether they were targeted for atomic bombs or firebombing, which was about as devastating, but they weren't damaged, not in any serious degree. And it's a very sweet story because Langdon Warner died some number of years later, and he wasn't a wealthy man, and his wife, who outlived him by quite a while, was not well and didn't have hardly any money. And the people of those two towns in Japan created a small monument in his honor and raised enough funds for her to live out her life in a very comfortable and respectable way. So these are some great stories. You saw the photographs of our ceremony in Washington, that we had these veterans' families, their nephews and stepson were there respectively, and you know, they're very, very happy stories against a very, very tough time with very few happy stories, and they bring honor to the veterans that served, and they, I think, reinforce these principles that General Eisenhower, I believe, went as far as anybody could humanly go to trying to repeatedly instill in his commanders. Yes, sir.
Curious, Robert. We hear mostly, and of course through your wonderful works, about Europe, at least Western Europe, and of course the Soviet Union was a closed society for so many years until the fall of the wall. Has there been any research on that or knowledge about that? Have you got into that at all as far as Eastern Europe and what happened there?
Sure. So the question is, if I may, what is the what were the counterparts to what the Monuments Men and the Western Allied nations did in Europe with their Soviet counterparts, and what happened following the war? We can sometimes, I think, look at this period of World War II at the end of the war as the good, bad, and the ugly. Certainly the Nazis are going to be the bad, and we want to believe, and I think rightfully so, the United States, Great Britain, and our Western allies were the good, and the Soviets would be the ugly part, I think. My remarks have to be tempered by this very harsh number, and numbers can be used to do all sorts of things in your favor or against you, but these numbers are so enormous, they really do speak for themselves. There were 390,000 American men and women killed during World War II. I mentioned that number earlier. There were 25 million Soviets killed, about we think, you know, maybe as many as 15, 17 million civilians, the balance soldiers. The fighting was just horrific. Of course, the problem is Stalin was such a bad guy himself and may have killed numbers approximating that, before and after the war that he's a very unsympathetic figure, and it has colored our view of the Soviet Union, that and many other things. The Soviets' policy at the end of the war was this. On Stalin's orders, what had not already been picked up and carried back to the former Soviet countries by Red Army troops before Stalin's orders came down were officially, his orders were officially to pack things up, and we don't speak just of works of art, but libraries, factories disassembled, anything that had financial benefit or industrial reuse was to be taken back to the Soviet Union, partly due to the reality that much of their society was non-functional because of the extent of the scorched earth policies of the Nazis, effectively implemented in many cases, and partly due to Stalin's belief that at Potsdam, the four major powers, the United States, Great Britain, France, and Soviet Union, had agreed on dollar sums of war reparations. Restitution is our fancy word for giving back something that was taken. Reparations is another fancy term to say that essentially we've designated a number that you should be compensated, and we may not have the cash to do it, but we'll do it through bartering. So if there's paintings, if there's factories, whatever it is, we need to accumulate $10 billion to give to Soviet Union to settle this agreed upon sum. And in fact, $10 billion was a number that was discussed at Potsdam when in the early stages of the meetings there was contemplation of doing something like that, but it didn't go anywhere, and there was never an agreement. But in Stalin's mind, once it was brought up, that's as good as done. And he argued to his grave that it was entirely right that the Soviet Union would remove what people estimate as 2.5 to 3 million or more cultural objects from Germany that they came across. Mind you, many of the things they found weren't just belonging to German museums. They might have been in a German museum, but they could have been individuals' belongings that they gave to the museum to safekeep for them, to try and keep it away from bombing or fires or things like that. There were some, in some cases, Jewish Germans who had things that had friends in the museum community that stored these things there to try and keep them both from the Nazis at the beginning and then everybody else later on too. So it wasn't just Germans' stuff originally. In the mid-1950s, 56, 57, 58, in that time period, the Soviets, in an effort to show the world what good guys they were, returned many of those millions of things back to the places that they'd taken them from. Mind you that these places they were returning them to were all part now of the Soviet Union sphere. So East Germany, Dresden, other towns like that. So they were giving these things back, never contemplating that the Soviet Union might evolve to where it didn't own all those territories, and there'd come a day when the things that they did have control of that today they would never give back, they gave back at a period of time never thinking that they might not have control over them, fortuitously so. In the 80s and 90s, word leaked out of, in the early 1990s, word leaked out of Russia that there were things hidden in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg and the Pushkin Museum in Moscow that were vehemently denied for a period of time, and then they acknowledged, in fact, they did have these things. And they have since put them on display. If you go to Moscow or you go to St. Petersburg, you can see these really incredible, mostly impressionist paintings, but they have all sorts of things, in a remarkable state of condition. And they called it originally Hidden Treasures, then they've since called it Hidden Treasures Revealed, and now there's a push within the museum communities there to take them out of the single rooms that they're in, where you have Manet after Monet after Renoir after Cezanne, and blend them into the museum's holdings so that they don't even distinguish what their background is. And laws have been passed in the Soviet Duma, their Congress equivalent, prohibiting the return of any of these works of art back to Germany, period. There's some wiggle room if it could be proven perhaps it belonged to a Jewish individual, et cetera, although those cases are rare. So this is the battlefield that gets fought today in that arena. There are progressive Russians who feel like they're European, they've got to get along with their neighbors. This is, it's time for this wound to heal. But while those voices were fairly outspoken, although not in the majority in the 90s before Putin of the last 7 or 8 years, their voices we don't hear anymore for reasons that are obvious, and they're not welcome voices or opinions. So even had Putin not risen to power and taken the degree of control that he seems to have mastered presently, I would have said it would have taken the passage of generations for these horrible wounds to begin to heal, where there might be a more enlightened view about this. But this is obviously a huge setback, I think, in the judgment of all people of goodwill everywhere for Russia, which is an important country. And it's a, you know, I think back to our patron here today, General Eisenhower, who at the end of the war hated the Germans, couldn't feel more strongly, having visited the concentration camps, and in my opinion heroically spoke up about it immediately to his wife and to General Marshall, and wanted press people and members of Congress to be sent over there to see it, in his immortal words, so that someday people don't say it didn't happen. Who could have imagined it wouldn't take but 60 years before those people would show up? And he questioned at the outset whether Germans could be rehabilitated. His views moderated fairly quickly, and he looked at Germany quite different because the world circumstances changed so quickly. But at that point in time, he flew to Moscow with Marshal Zhukov, his counterpart in the Soviet Red Army, who he had a good relationship with, and they flew to Moscow about at treetop level from Berlin. That's a long flight. And Eisenhower remarked that he didn't see anything higher than a chimney stack still standing from Berlin to Moscow. And it colored, aside from his acute understanding of the role that the Soviet Red Army had in defeating Nazi Germany and some of the horrific losses in places like Berlin that otherwise would have been American boys, he had tremendous sympathy for the sense of destruction he saw and the people that had caused it. But as I say, things changed. And I think that was something he probably misjudged. And I mean, he misjudged. I think he probably, in his own way, kind of acknowledged that. I don't know about misjudged as much as he, being the decent guy he was, wanting to believe this will work out pretty well. But things changed. So it's a real problem. The only other thing I'll say about this on a deeply personal level, I've been to St. Petersburg 3 or 4 times, and Moscow once. And in St. Petersburg, when we were there filming for Rape of Europa documentary, we went out to Piskaryskoye Cemetery, which is a cemetery that's about 15 to 20 minutes outside the main part of St. Petersburg. And there's a very attractive guardhouse at the entrance to the cemetery. And you get out there, and it's this beautiful park. It's not near as pretty as Colleyville-sur-Mer or the American Cemetery in Rome, but it's quite pretty, and it's in a forested area that has all the trees removed in the center section, and you have these mounds that, given the life experience of those in the audience, you all will all know what a TV dinner used to be. Some of the younger people in my office don't know what those were. And so it looks like the TV dinner tray upside down. It's angled like this from all four sides. It's a rectangle, and it has a mound of dirt that's about 3 feet off the ground, and it is about the length from that wall to this wall and about 20 feet out. And there were 10,000 people buried in each one of those mounds. And there are 100 of those mounds out there. Do the math. 1 million people. Actually, I think it's more like 1 million too. The only thing to identify whether it's a soldier or a citizen is either a hammer and sickle or a red star. Hammer and sickle if it's a Soviet citizen, red star if it was a soldier, because they don't know the names. The guardhouse, where at the entrance, is where, when the blockade, the blockade of St. Petersburg or Leningrad began in 1941 for almost 1,000 days, not quite 3 years. So the city's encircled and people start, most of them died off starvation, very gruesome way to go. There were some that were killed in bombings, and so they start bringing them to the guardhouse in carts, and they have a log there, and they note so-and-so name and the district that they're from. So there might have been 10 people, and there's a log, and it shows the district and the names of everybody. Well, then the pace of deaths increases, and they can't keep up with it. So then they fill in, 100 people from so-and-so district, but they don't put the names down. And after a while, they can't begin to keep up with it, and it stops. And so these mass graves are there. And what was most poignant for me, in this forested area, on all these trees within view, you see these small cameo photographs that are in glass cases or plastic cases. Almost all of them have water bubbled up inside. Some you can't see the photos anymore. But these are the people's relatives who died during this period that are out there somewhere. And the people who are the relatives don't know where, and so they've come and hammered the cameos on a tree in homage to their relative that's there somewhere. And I don't know about your all's experience in this part of the world, but I can tell you in Dallas, Texas, my dad's, who was a World War II veteran of the Pacific, is buried at a cemetery in Dallas, and I go by occasionally to see him, but for the most part, no one goes to cemeteries unless someone's being buried. Occasionally you see someone out there pretty much by themselves. At this cemetery at Piskarskoye, there are people out there having picnics every day. Great-grandparents, grandparents, their kids, their grandkids. Kids are running around playing. They've got lunches. And at the end of the long arcade is this stone sign, and etched in it are these magnificently spoken words, and the punchline is, "Don't ever forget." And so when you start to think about what would be involved, the sublimation of ego, the sense of forgiveness on the part of the Soviets or Russians that have been through these difficult times, regardless of how they got there, regardless of how bad Stalin was before, or things that happened after that, it's drilled into them that don't forget, don't forgive's the implication, and it's a problem, and we see it surfacing again today. This sense of pride about that, and God, I just don't know. There's so many great things we can say about the United States, but not the least of which is we have done a much better job honoring our World War II veterans than we've done honoring some of our other veterans in the in-between wars. But we've also found a way, I think, to move beyond these things and realize that we've got to find a way to get along with people in the world. And these historical alliances of ours, I mean, you've seen these couple of video clips we ran of ISIS. We need all the friends we're going to get. And the historical alliances we've had have been, over the course of time, important ones. And I think what we can do to strengthen those is good. And that's why the return of these cultural treasures has been really big events, because while we may not think it's a big deal to return 5 paintings to Germany, it's on the front page of the papers over there, because they can't believe our respect for the law. They can't believe people came forward to return these things and we didn't pay them any money and they didn't ask for it. We just did it because it was the right thing to do. So that's a good thing, and I think it's the kind of country we want to project ourselves to be. Other easy questions? Yes, sir.
You referenced ISIS. Is anything being done today with museums or other areas where monuments are being preserved that are in proximity with the radical Islamist movements to get those particular items out of that general location?
It's a great question, and it's a comprehensive question. I'll try and give as truncated answer as I can. Yes, there are a lot of people of goodwill out there trying to do the right things and moving these things out. There's an interesting debate that's broken out among the museum and archaeological communities, which there's a lot of tension between those two groups. Some in the archaeological community / scholarly community, when you read the things they say or hear what they say, much of it, not all of it, sounds very almost anti-capitalist. There's something wrong with people, with collectors or museums buying and collecting works of art because it creates demand, and then people are incented in these third or fourth world countries to go illegally dig and find these things to sell them, and if we could just get rid of the demand, then they wouldn't go do that. Personally, I think it's a little bit naive. And private collectors and museums serve an important role in the food chain of how museums get funding, how they're able to acquire things that we all like to go see, and they're not all boogeymen. So there's a balance to be struck. The museum community, which is very acquisitive, they love to get things for their collection, where they have had problems in years past, in particular at the Getty, being found having works of art that they have bought with a lot of paperwork attached to it, but the underlying documents have been falsified, whether or not they were aware of it or not, whether their degree of due diligence was enough or not, but where they found works of art that have been recently excavated but have been claimed to have been excavated long, long ago, that certainly feeds in to the other side saying, see, we told you so. This is exactly what the problem is. So you have these two camps that are oftentimes bashing heads. The interesting the debate that's broken out is this. Some in the museum community, and they're very smart, worldly people and thoughtful people in regards to this, have argued that in the case of Syria, the best thing that could happen is as much stuff there that could be stolen or that ISIS steals and allows to be sold but gets out as possible is probably the best chance to have stuff there survive, because otherwise they're going to destroy it all. Now that's a pretty audacious statement, and of course the archaeological community, many over there feel like, see, we told you so. What a self-serving comment. You're just saying that so you all can be some of the ones to get it. That may or may not be true, but the fact of the matter is, at the rate things are moving right now, it's not as crazy idea as it may sound. So these, I guess my point in being here today and to be talking about what the Monuments Men Foundation is doing and what we're trying to do in getting this discussion out of scholars over here and museum people over here is to say, you know what, there's 320 million Americans in the country, and most of them, like me, didn't go to art history class, and they're not scholars, and neither are they archaeologists or museum people, but they're decent people that see these videos, and whether we love art or not, it's repulsive. It makes us sick to our stomach. Someone said to me, it's like killing children. I said, it's not like it, it is. These are, these monuments, they can't get up and walk out. No, they depend on people to take care of them and survive, and they do belong to all of us, regardless of where they are. So we're trying to find a way to get all of us taxpayers who elect these people who are supposed to be leaders to have a chance to have a voice in the conversation, because best I can tell, we've been left out of the conversation. The same 200 people go off and talk to the other counterparts of 200 people, and they all, UNESCO talks to ICRAM, and ICRAM talks to safe, and it's a whole bunch of acronyms most people don't know. My view is, you know what? Most of the people in the country and the world know what Monuments Men is. George Clooney made sure of that. And that's a basis from which we can build. I take a really simple view. If we can do what we did during World War II with no technology, almost no support from the Army other than Eisenhower's order, which was a big deal to these guys, but still no Jeeps, no GPS systems, no 3D imaging, et cetera, just a group of middle-aged guys that are trying to figure it out on their own, a bunch of them hitchhiking their way across Europe. Surely we can do a better job today. Who among us would say that we're using all the tools at our hands, at all the resources we have to do all we can do? I mean, I don't think anybody would make that argument. So, no one's speaking up about that. It's just like we've entrusted the conversation to these people over here that are well-intended and doing a lot of stuff. They're busy. But, is it effective? Is it engaging the general public, that people like you all, even me to some degree, know all the things that are going on? Is the money that they do have, which indirectly comes from us as taxpayers, ultimately working its way to these groups, is it being spent wisely? There's no oversight. I just don't see how we can do worse. And so back to my point, I don't like giving up on anything. Most of you all know a fair bit about my background with Monuments Men and our efforts, my efforts 20 years ago, standing on a bridge in Florence when I first started studying art and architecture at 38 years old, thinking, you know what? I wonder how all this stuff survived World War II and where it was, because it couldn't have been here. That's how it all began. And I didn't know what the answer was. And I kept asking everybody, and all the people I'd met in Florence, where I'd moved to live for a while, said, you know what, that's a great question. What's the answer? And I said, I don't know. You live here. You ought to know. And they said the same thing that I heard for the next 9 years. I never had anybody tell me anything different, which was I never thought about it. I've been to Florence, never thought about it. Been to Paris, been to the Louvre, never thought about it. But of course, had to go somewhere else. What happened? And ultimately, I think that's why George Clooney and that cast was interested in it, because they hadn't thought about it either. And neither had the studios that gave them the money to make the film. So, you know what? My view is, aside from the fact that they did set the gold standard or high bar for the protection of cultural treasures during conflict, if everybody in the world, if enough people in the world know who they are and something about what they did, whether they saw the movie or not, oh yeah, those are the guys that saved the art during World War II. You know what? That's all we need to build off of, because that's a lot more than me asking them, what's UNESCO? What's ICROM? I tell you, I'll settle for you telling me what the acronym stands for. Or I'd settle for you telling me generally what it is that they do. I think it's a real small percentage of the population. And here's a rhetorical question for you all. What cause out there, whether it's world hunger, battered women, our environment, I mean, every cause I know of, they've got spokespeople for it that you all know of. Bono, George Clooney with Sudan, Angela Jolie, Mother Teresa with hunger, et cetera. I mean, no one's speaking about trying to preserve culture. So I just think the public ought to have a voice in the conversation. And we're trying to make it easy for the public to have a conversation. When I go travel around the country, in particular when I'm in colleges, I need about 5 minutes with college kids, and they're sitting there saying, what can we do to help? You don't have to lecture us anymore. We're already like in. And I haven't known what to say. And this is the outgrowth of that. You know, we figured, I wish I had the answer. I wish there was an easy answer. But I know this, that there's a lot of smart people out there, and there's a lot of people that think very differently than scholars. Scholars and the people in the cultural preservation arena, they speak so many languages, but one language they don't speak a lot of times is plain language that's easy for everybody to understand. And I'm not talking about dumbing down. I'm talking about just laying it out simply like Eisenhower and George Stout and Mason Hammond did. It's not hard to understand what they said. So we're trying to give people a platform to be able to participate and share what their ideas are, because I think somewhere in there is the answer. And I also believe this. Politicians are an interesting bunch, and one thing I can say about them that I feel sure is true is of the things that they may not pay attention to, they pay a lot of attention to what voters are paying attention to. And that was why getting the film, why I wrote the book, was to get the film made so we could reach the 100 countries around the world that the Monuments Men film showed in. 100 countries. The book's been translated in 30 some odd languages now. And again, whether people saw it or not, there was so much marketing and advertising. Now there's a brand out there. People know something about what it is you're talking about. And all that resulted in us getting an invitation to go to the White House and show the film there. Now, it didn't have all the repercussions that I have wished for, but it's a step in the right direction. And if this much I feel certain we can say, if we have 1 million people as we start this campaign, and we're just at the beginning, you all are the first people to hear about it. We're a poor little organization. We got 5 or 6 people, but I know the power of what can happen when you get people behind you. And we were 1 person when we started off with this idea 20 years ago. So I'm always amused when people tell me, are you crazy? There's no way you'll ever get this done. And I say, you know what? It's got to be easier than getting George Clooney to make a film of your book. So in any event, you know, off we go. But I believe if we can get 1 million people around the country to do no more than go to our foundation website and just either put their name in or they can put their initials. We're not trying to go out and, you know, do anything with the names. We're just trying to get as many people signed up as we can. That's a voice. And that's a seat at the table to have discussion about this and play devil's advocate and ask some tough questions that I don't think are getting asked. So I want to underscore, there's a lot of people that are doing a lot of good work. There's a lot of people on the ground in these countries risking their lives to try and save things. You all may recall in Iraq in 2003 the mistakes we made in not protecting the cultural institutions there, which were pretty quickly remedied, but not before the biggest damage was done, which was media reports that 257,000 things were missing from the museum. And it took a couple of months before even we figured out, because we weren't prepared the way we should have been, that in fact it was 15,000, and that the difference between 15,000 and 257,000 were all the things that the museum employees wisely realized we better go bury them in the sand, take them home, and do the same thing that their European colleagues 65 years before did in France, in Italy, and in other countries. And that's happening to some degree in these places. But, you know, the Islamic State's philosophy and their interpretation of the Quran, these are not crazy people. This is absolutely mandated by their interpretation of the Quran, that everything that is respected, worshipped, admired, that's created by man is blasphemy, and it has to be destroyed. It's not open for discussion. And it's a grim situation. So, like I say, I don't like to give up on things. Perhaps something will change. I'm not advocating, you know, that we do things militarily, but what I'm trying to say is that what worked during World War II worked because we planned ahead. We weren't scrambling all the time. We were scrambling for the things we couldn't anticipate because we'd planned for the things that we could. And we haven't been planning. The people that are in countries that are at risk haven't been planning. Maybe they will now as a result of what's happening in Syria. But it's going to be a real shame if the price of tuition of learning this is the cost of the cultural treasures in Syria, and then we don't learn that lesson. Because that may be the cost regardless, and then there will be another Syria. And that's what I would hate to see, partly because I care about these other countries and what's in them, but equally, these guys like Walter Hutchausen that died, it wasn't just about World War II. I mean, you of our greatest generation that fought this war, as Eisenhower said, you know, it's wars fought for ideals that are far greater than just ending this war. And I think we fight for freedom of speech, we fight for freedom of religion, we fight to preserve a way of life, and that includes cultural treasures which we admire and like. Let me answer 2 of the questions and then we're going to quit. Yes, sir.
I've got kind of a backward look at this.
That could be what we've been missing.
If you go to, you want to go see the statues on the top of the Parthenon, you go to London and see the Elgin marbles. If you want to see the Ishtar Gate, you don't go to the Middle East, you go to Berlin. and they hid those pretty well during the war. And Joanne and I were in St. Petersburg about 15 years ago and walked into a room like this that you're describing.
Yep.
Side by side, every artist you ever heard of. You could walk up and touch them. There were really no guards, just a million people. And my thought was, if they wouldn't have rounded this stuff up after the war, during the war, what would have happened to it? It would have been looted. Same way with the Germans. I don't want to pat them on the back for stealing that stuff, but at least they put it in mines and they put it in places where we didn't blow it up. Did they have a role in really preserving it accidentally?
There's no question about it. It's one of the many paradoxes. In fact, the image that you saw, you'll see it come up here. I'll just kind of let this click through. Of this American rabbi chaplain standing on this pile of Torah scrolls 10 feet high. And there were 1,000 Torah scrolls that he's unrolling this sacred parchment, trying to identify what synagogue it had come from, what country it belonged to. So you figure of all the things that, that would have survived the war, 1,000 Torah scrolls, I mean, that seems like ground zero for destruction with the Nazis. But there was a reason they didn't destroy them. They were intending on building racial museums to demonstrate how, in their view, Jews and Slavs were subhuman. And this was part of their effort to preserve these things for a later date. So it's one of the great paradoxes, is an effort to do something bad enough that they've murdered people, bad enough they've stolen what they believe in, and in so many ways bad enough that the reason they saved it is because they want to make a museum to honor all of this. But the reality is they survived because of that, and they wouldn't have survived otherwise. So yeah, I mean, you've made a great point, and I come across this a lot. You know, I had a very well-intended 19 or 20-year-old at Harvard when Matt Damon and I spoke there prior to the film coming out last February, a year ago February, say, don't you think it's horrible, which is the beginning of a how long have you been beating your wife question. Don't you think it's horrible that we spent all this time and resources trying to protect works of art during World War II instead of trying to get Jews out of concentration camps? And I said, it's not an either-or thing. And if we'd have had an army of thousands of monuments men and had spent ungodly amounts of budget resources and jeeps and tanks and all sorts of stuff, I still think that wouldn't have been an imprudent allocation, but we didn't. We had 50 or 60 middle-aged guys hitchhiking their way around Europe that didn't have cameras and any other supplies other than their intuition and resources to their initiative to figure out how to get stuff done. So, you know, the perception is when you hear these men and women found and returned 5 million objects, 4 million of which were stolen, that there must have been thousands of them. How else could they do that? Well, that wasn't the case. So there's a lot of misconceptions about that. But back to your point earlier about Syria and the question of what's going on there, you know, it's a pretty compelling argument that, a very sad one in my view, that maybe the best thing that can happen in some of those areas is for things to be looted. It's also been proposed now, this issue of partage. Their community's got some great words. Partage. So partage is when the two, the United States and Germany, both agree to do a dig in country X and split the cost, or and share in what's found, or the United States may put up 100% of the cost for a country that doesn't have the resources to put up any money, and they'll split what's found. It's a fancy term for that. There's been a discussion that maybe there should be more of that as a way of getting things out, where those things could be shared. Of course, the monuments men wisely concluded nothing will be a more long-lasting sore between countries than the removal of one country's things being in another. And we see it today with the Elgin marbles. We see it with the bust of Nefertiti, which the monuments men found and had sitting on their desk for 2 years before they could give it back, right there. And yeah, they're festering wounds. And we see, as you said, in Russia, those works there that are an ongoing problem between those two countries that they'll have to at some point in time address, or it's going to continue to be a problem. So those are the challenges of the times that we face. But I think these are interesting issues, and they're great issues for younger people to be getting involved in, because they're going to be the ones living in the world that deals with these problems for a long, long time. They're not going away. One other question, and we're going to adjourn. Yes, ma'am.
It's not so much a question, just a statement. All the stuff that's taken out, all the stuff that's lost, yes, those are things, they can be moved. Sad part, you can't move a building, you lose architecture.
Well, this is true. You lose architecture, you lose monuments like the Bamiyan Buddhas that the Taliban proudly blew up in 2001. You know, back to your point, sir, because I overlooked adding this on as an addendum, and it speaks to your point. The Nazis, you know, how many bad things can we say about them? Probably not enough. But what's particularly disturbing about what's going on with the Islamic State is that while Hitler and the Nazis' ideology at the outset did result in thousands of books being burned, some hundreds or low thousands, not that it really matters, I mean, one's too many, but low thousands of works of art that were considered degenerate being destroyed, and then tens of thousands of works of art that were considered degenerate being removed from Germany's museums on order of the Fuhrer because they violated their census, which happily found homes in other museums around the world, including many of ours in this country. For the most part, there was a practicality to them of, okay, well, this is the ideology, but let's not destroy it. We can trade it for 10 old master paintings, or we can sell it and get some money. So the ideology was there, but it didn't take much push to come to the shove part where there was some element of commerciality about, we can get, as long as we just get it out of Germany or get it out of the Reich. We have a really different situation of what's going on in Syria right now, Syria and parts of Iraq with ISIS. I mean, they are authorizing the theft and sale by the people that are stealing these things, receiving commissions and taxing the activities. It's a very significant source of revenue for them. The things that are being resold are non-religious in their view. It might be an ass and a donkey and a bas-relief or something. But if there's anything at all that smacks of religion or worship, then if it's sell it and get revenue or destroy it, they destroy it because it's blasphemous, and there are no exceptions to their view. So this is a more, in my judgment, dangerous situation for works of art and cultural treasures, because they're not only not interested in the commercial opportunities if it's not ideologically acceptable to them, they are also going out of their way making these videos. And I had dinner with a acquaintance of mine night before last in Baltimore, was I? Who is one of the world's leading experts on ISIS, doing some great work on that. And this is a high priority for them, eliminating these things, and the recruiting. These videos are being used not to promote what they've done or show the West, but they're recruiting videos. That's what they're doing with it. Some in the archaeological community have said, I don't agree with this, that people have been destroying stuff all the way back to the Nazis. The only difference to what they're doing is they've now figured out how to bring technology in to show these videos. I think that's really missing the point here. That they are doing that, but it's a much bigger problem. So we're in for a tough time there, tougher than it's been, woe with the people that are there trying to do good without a whole lot of help. So it's a real tough situation, and I am hopeful things will turn out better in Syria than the trend is going, but I think we have to be much more mindful of looking over the horizon a little bit here, thinking it's not going to be the last place that confronts these kinds of problems. If we can at least say we learned something from it, shame on us for having to pay the kind of tuition that we're paying, but we at least learned something, then I think we could salvage the lesson and get things in a better shape and more consistent with the things that General Eisenhower, I believe, was, as I used earlier, very proud and privileged to play such an important role in. Thank you for having me back to Abilene. Maybe we'll see you in another 5 years.